The Mutual Broadcasting System presents STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. With today's briefing, here is retired Marine Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. Our Strategic Risk Assessment Talk is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to talk about not war, not conflicts, but certainly something that has tremendous impact. I'm going to talk about what's coming up this fall and winter, something that impacts the globe, but particularly impacts parts of the United States. And that's a weather event, if you want to call it that, or a weather system in the Pacific. It is a warming of the Pacific waters, and it's something called El Niño, which periodically happens, but this is called Super El Niño. And everything out there, they're saying, look, we haven't seen anything like this since at least 1950. Some say we've never seen anything this big in terms of this El Niño. And when El Niños happen, they bring a lot of precipitation. All that hot water, it tends to create a lot of very intense storms. Places like the west coast of the United States, we have these atmospheric rivers that come over and dump all over the place. And up in the higher mountains like the Sierra Nevadas, they put a lot of snow in there. And if you want to go back historically, which I will, we've seen some awful big events that have taken place, some massive flooding events that have taken place in California. And a lot of times you think, well, that's a long time ago. But when you talk about nature, it really doesn't care. Whether you say, well, we haven't had a San Andreas Fault earthquake like the Fort Tejon, thing since 1857. Frankly, geophysics really doesn't care if it happened in 1857. It could happen again tomorrow. Same thing with the weather. Something that hadn't happened since 1862. Again, it doesn't care. It will do whatever it's going to do because it periodically does things like that. So you just have to recognize that this is coming, and this is coming. What I say, they said they haven't given out exact numbers of how much rain or precipitation or whatever we're going to see. But they said, will this be a major event? Will this be a super precipitation year, weather year? And they said the latest prediction I saw was 100%. And I'm not an expert on statistics, but 100% sounds pretty close to certainty when you're looking at it. So I'm going to talk about some things, and I may shake some people up. People may go, well, it sounds a little bit partisan. I'm going to tell you, our lack of preparedness in this regard goes back over multiple administrations, back to the O's. I'm going to talk about some things that were really messed up under the Bush administration, some things that didn't happen under the Obama administration. And by the way, as you may have figured out, we're still not there yet. So it's probably something that the current administration needs to take to heart. But anyway, for reference, many years ago, just so you know, I've traveled all around the world, all around the country, dealing with a variety of different threats, helping U.S. government, helping the U.S. government help foreign governments, foreign officials, foreign militaries, top U.S. commands, both public-private sector, all prepare for a wide variety of catastrophic events, whether it's flooding, tsunamis, earthquakes, severe weather, landslides, terrorism, pandemics, you name it. I was part of some teams and some organizations that's what we did. When I was in uniform, there was a mission set that started really kind of in the 90s that has lasted for a very long time called consequence management. And that's how the military kind of addressed it, was we're trying to manage the consequences of these big events, because when the military gets involved, usually something really big has happened. You don't see federal military troops come in, whether it's here or overseas, unless something really catastrophic is taking place. So the term consequence management became a term of art. And while it was initially focused on, preparedness, response, mitigation, to some extent prevention, but mostly on mitigation type of stuff, to threats. Initially, these threats were focused, and this was a military thing, on chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, high-yield explosive type events. This is what we call weapons of mass destruction type stuff. But as this mission area matured, we started looking at other things, what we call all threats, all hazards, of course, being all the natural disasters I just talked about. And I spent a lot of time doing that in uniform, working with that in a variety of different places all over the place. Now, each of the geographic commands around the world, the ones responsible for the Pacific arena, the ones that are responsible for Europe and Africa and the Middle East and, Latin America and, Central South America, parts of the Caribbean. And of course, a lot of it focused on North America under U.S. Northern Command. They all have some sort of consequence management contingency organization. To my knowledge, Pacific commands I actually worked with for years. They had a standing joint task force that was working on this, as does U.S. Northern Command. The other ones are more contingency things, large organizations, commands. For example, and if you were to go up to Washington State, up around Tacoma, I-Corps, the U.S. Army's I-Corps, which is a very large organization, was prepared to take over the mission of Joint Task Force, which means all services, a joint, we call Purple organization, that would come together that would work on consequence management. For a while, that was dual-hatted to the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, which I was a member of. We handed it off to the Army for Pacific Command, but we kept the Middle East. And then after 9/11, I went over to the Middle East as a Director of Intelligence, or J2, of what was called a Combined Joint Task Force, which meant we had allied organizations, members of other countries' militaries that were involved in this thing. And so it's just another way of saying I've done a lot of this stuff. I also ran a joint intelligence center that was doing a lot of intelligence production, focused on supporting these consequence management joint task force missions for multiple combatant commands. And so anyway, I have a long background working in this mission area, and this was going before 9/11. This was going after 9/11. There was just a lot of stuff going on with that, and then working with these other organizations that fill into this mission. It's a long way of saying, from an intelligence perspective, there was a lot of groundwork that's been done over the many years. A lot of it taking from, when the military does something, they have a certain way of doing business. And one of those things we do is we have a focused intelligence support program. The idea of intelligence from a military standpoint, operational standpoint, is intelligence drives decision-making. You decide what is going to be your course of action. You have a higher degree of situational awareness and understanding that goes into a very methodical way to arrive at what will hopefully be the optimal decision on what we're supposed to do. That is a very different process than what we see on the civilian side. I'm not saying there isn't a process. I teach the process on the civilian side of how that's done. But what I will say is the military has a lot more rigor to it. Not surprisingly, they've been doing these big operations for a very long time, and they have a very methodical way of going about doing this stuff. There was a desire to take that methodology and move that over to the public safety sphere. And I've been involved with that for a very, very long time, going back to the 1990s, with the war on drugs, and then later after 9/11, with everything we're doing afterwards with that. So a big desire to do that stuff. And I'm going to say, frankly, having worked intensively in the area of Homeland Security with FEMA, DHS, and all the state and local organizations, what we're doing on the military side was definitely more focused intelligence support for decision makers than what I saw them doing, particularly back in the O's. All right. So DHS, FEMA, and most importantly, state and local governments need what the military was doing in this consequence management intelligence realm. And they needed what was being done there, and they knew they needed it. Now, if you ask any organization or bureaucracy how they're doing, how they're prepared, are you guys ready to do stuff at any given time, they're going to normally say, yeah, we're ready to go. We're ready, we're able. But you'll see some sort of platitudinous response to that regard about being ready and able. And then if you listen long enough, they'll also say, but we need more funding, and we would really like to be able to do this. So there'll always be a funding thing wrapped in there somewhere. But that's pretty much the combination of statements. It's a common refrain. All right. I worked with FEMA closely with what I was doing in uniform starting around 2003. I worked the first major real-world operation disaster that the U.S. Northern Command ever did. I was in that joint task force. I worked the first major operational exercise that U.S. Northern Command ever did. I was very much involved in that thing as well, working with the joint task force. And I was there when Hurricane Katrina was going on. And part of my team was actually at JTF Katrina while that whole thing was going on. And so I had a kind of inside view of what was going on there, what was happening with Katrina. And prior to that, we'd seen that there were some real shortfalls. We'd seen some problems with the way FEMA did stuff. One of the big problems FEMA had, and this certainly from my perspective as a former J2 in this area and director of intelligence in this area, I thought that what they did in terms of risk assessment, threat assessment, decision support, intelligence for decision makers needed a lot of work. And I was constantly asking questions during Katrina, probably sounded like a broken record, saying, well, what happens when state and local leaders don't know the extent of the damage? What happens when they don't realize the risks that are involved there? What if they don't know where their problem areas are? And I'd always get this federal response of, it's not our problem. You know, the system is that they have to ask us to do this. And then we saw Hurricane Katrina, which was probably the greatest failure in FEMA history, one of the greatest failures in U.S. government disaster support history. And it was exactly what we talked about, which is you had the governor of Louisiana, you had the mayor of New Orleans, who simply did not know how bad it was. And we say, well, what do you need? They didn't know. In fact, Mayor Nagin of New Orleans would constantly go on TV and say, send everything. And I can tell you on the checklist of things that we had that we could send, everything was not an item that you could put on that checklist. So this brought up this thing of, hey, they need to have a better way of doing this, not just on a response level, but in a proactive level, guiding decisions for emergency preparedness, mitigation, all these things across the board. And of course, everything driving response to include driving recovery efforts as well. They need to have this decision support intelligence capability. And there were those back in Washington, D.C. who recognized this. There were some really smart folks over at DHS who realized this needed to be done because they saw how just spectacularly we had failed. And they were working on this for years. They were working on obviously after 9/11, under the Bush administration, the big focus was on terrorism. But certainly after Hurricane Katrina, there was a little bit of a turnaround and say, we've got to really start looking at some of these other disasters as well. And they did. Now, what came out of this, and this is just the way they do it, is they design things. When they say that, hey, we want to go do something with a lot of federal funding attached in this area, they will do something called a comprehensive preparedness guide, all right, or a CPG. We've done it for a bunch of stuff. I could go through all the different CPGs. You'll go, oh, that's associated with that program. Oh, that's what that's all about. Yeah, we got CPGs for doing all kinds of things. There was one that was put out called CPG 502. And that was to basically integrate an intelligence program that they've been working on for a few years at the time with emergency operations centers, emergency preparedness, and all the things I just discussed before. That was CPG 502. Very, a document that I will say politically, it got a little watered down before they went to final print. I was a little disappointed. There was some stronger language before that didn't show up in the final version, but nonetheless, it was put out there. All right. In Southern California, I was very much involved with this. We tried to implement CPG 502. We had a series of workshops working with everybody we brought in. We had folks from public safety across the board, federal, state, local partners, private sector came in. A lot of emergency management folks kind of scratch their heads going, well, what exactly is this thing that you're trying to do? Some actually concerned to go, is this another organization I'm going to have to report to? And we're like, no. This is an organization that's going to support you. And we need to figure out how we do that in the most seamless, painless way that could possibly happen to provide you what you need. This was what we were working on. And this was going around 2011 into 2012. And it seemed to be going pretty well. And we got shut down by the state of California. Ironically, it was an official in California Department of Justice that made the decision that, in so many words, was saying this isn't needed. And it's like, really? You're telling DHS and FEMA this isn't what they need to do with their money? But in the politics of the time, hey, it was what it was, all right? And they managed to shut that down. Some other changes happened, and eventually, when states like Florida and Texas wanted to implement this in their states, they were forced by DHS to call California to say, hey, can we do this? And then California was like, oh, no, you can't do this. And then if they said you can do this, they would turn around and say, oh, you need to hire the state of California or state institute to come to your state to teach you how to do this. And they actually didn't have a program to teach them how to do that. Or you need to hire these companies that coincidentally seem to be owned or employed state employees that work for that same institute. Yes, there were ethics problems. Yes, there were conflict of interest problems. Yes, there were all sorts of things. Everybody knew this was going on. When I mean everybody, DHS knew it was going on. DHS OIG knew it was going on. They're going to hate for me to say this, but I know several members of the FBI that knew this was going on. But it was just the tenor of the times, and this was happening. And long story short, CPG 502 never get out there. Now, what was CPG 502 going to do? It was going to do multidisciplinary, interagency, intergovernmental, meaning all different types of levels of government, integrated public-private sector work, assessment to figure out what was the threat, what was the risk, what do we need to look at, and put this in a comprehensive way that would provide decision support products. I know if there were some folks out there who say, well, this is kind of like intelligence preparation for battle. Yeah, decision support templates would be a term that they might use, but it was going to provide this stuff for state and local leaders. All right. One of the things that wasn't as apparent to everybody that I knew, because I'd worked a lot on pandemic influenza preparedness, both here in the U.S. and around the world with various large military commands, was that if you're here in the U.S., decisions on quarantine, shutting down various things like schools and libraries and, doing all these restrictive measures, these were not federal decisions. These were by design things at the state and local level, the local director of health at the county director of health or the state director of health or something like that. They would make those decisions. That's despite what you may see in movies or TV shows, those were not being made by the Center for Disease Control. Those were actually state and local decisions. And part of this was to create that decision support capability at the state and local level. That is what got shut down. And the reason I say that is because we don't have it now. And that is a big problem in what we're facing now. It is when you look at where we are now, when you look at what's coming up, this is a great loss, in so many words, just to give you an idea. When in COVID, during the pandemic, the White House came out and made a statement talking about, all the failures at the state level mostly, but state and local level, in terms of, and saying that, and basically just making a broad statement saying about half the casualties or losses that we've experienced so far should have been avoided. They should have been avoided. And if we had this capability in place, like FEMA and DHS had originally intended, they probably would have been avoided. We probably would have avoided a lot of the firestorm deaths that we saw at Paradise. Because at Paradise, that was at one of the Sierra Nevadas up in Northern California, the things they kept citing were, they couldn't do the reverse 911 because they had bad cell phone coverage. Well, that wasn't something you discover when the fire's happening. They had narrowed the roads so they couldn't get as many cars down the road. Well, again, the roads didn't suddenly get narrowed when the fire started. That was happening well before. So in other words, that sort of assessment process, looking across the board, doing the what if from a variety of different things, it just wasn't happening. And you could take that into what happened with the Palisades fire. You can take that into what happened in Montecito, where they missed some critical meteorological intelligence that came in. All sorts of things. This was a needed capability that just didn't happen. Now, the money that was supposed to go for this, within that particular example I gave you, ended up getting circumvented, and then all of a sudden there was a bunch of money that ended up in, guess what? That same state institute I just aforementioned, which at that time had been slated for closure because it was felt that wasn't needed, but they kept it open. And since that state institute charges us for stuff about 2 to 5 times, I should say, the going commercial rate, They needed all the help they could get, and that was how they helped them, was to make them the only place to get this stuff using federal funds. Yes, you can talk about the legalities and the ethics and everything else, but I'm not going to focus on that. What I am going to say is, here we are. Why is that important now? Regardless of the ethical and legal implications, we've got this massive El Nino event coming in. And the point I want to make on this is, if you think there's this big all hazards, all threats intelligence capability working at the state and local level, you're going to find enough officials to go, oh yeah, we do that. Yeah, we know how to do that. Yeah, we're working on that. Yeah, we're focused on that. They're going to say that now. And I'm going to say the same phrase that we used to say, 20 years ago. They sound like FEMA the day before Katrina. They sound like, they're kind of smug. Some of them might be rather arrogant, saying that they're doing all this stuff. But the reality is, this thing that they were supposed to put in after Katrina, this thing that was supposed to happen, never happened. We're looking at a major event of weather coming in. It's going to hit across the Southwest. It's going to hit California. It's going to hit other states. Florida is getting prepared for this, to give you an idea of just how big this is. The Pacific Northwest, correspondingly, is actually looking at a potential drought event because basically all the weather is going to shift south as far as the atmospheric rivers. And so that's going to cause a less precipitation up in the Pacific Northwest. Anyway, it's a big one. All right. And in California, for a lot of times, this was called the other big one. But let me talk to you about what happened in 1861-62. There was massive atmospheric rivers, arc storms that came in and hit the state. That's how the state gets most of its rain, is atmospheric rivers. This thing came in and it was so big, it did some amazing things. For example, I think in Marina del Rey, within a week's time period, they measured 50-some inches of rain. 50-some inches of rain is a lot of rain, okay? And they weren't set up for that. And that was not the worst place in the state. The Central Valley, which at one time was they had Tulare Lake, or the Tule Lake, I'm sorry, and that's Tulare County is named after the Tules. But that lake out there, and I grew up near that near where that was. That lake was a big honking lake that we basically in this last century pretty much dried up. All right. But nothing changed. It's still the low basin area it is. And during the last big set of storms, it started filling up again. Back in 1861-62, there was no flood control. There were not all these, canals and levees and dams and stuff like that. So that lake got so big, you could take a steamboat from Stockton, California, way up north, not that far from San Francisco, all the way down to Bakersfield, which is way down south at the south end of the Central Valley, just over the mountains from Los Angeles. And you could do it by boat. That's how much water was. Parts of the LA basin were filled up with water. Orange County had huge chunks of Orange County were filled up with water. Sacramento, the state capital, was so flood inundated, they had to remove state government from Sacramento for 2 years because essentially the city was underwater. So that's how bad this thing is. Now, we have a lot of flood control and a lot of other capabilities today we didn't have back then. But I'll tell you what else we have. We have a lot of infrastructure. And we have an entire country that's dependent on a lot of stuff that comes to or through California. The largest port in the United States, combined seaport, is Long Beach, LA Port in Southern California. I think 40% of the container traffic that comes into the North America goes through that one port. That gets sent all over the place. You get a massive storm thing like this, knocking out railroads and roads and all sorts of stuff. You have a supply chain problem, which magnifies itself all the way across the continent. So this is another way to say we got a lot of preparedness to do, a lot of thinking. We have to think about supply chains. We have to think about, obviously protecting people, but protecting industries, doing lots of stuff. It needs to be interagency, intergovernmental, multidisciplinary, and it needs to integrate both the public and the private sector. And I say this because I'm just not seeing the level of activity I would expect or hope to see going on. And if somebody wants to get a hold of me and say, hey, Hal, you're not looking in the right place, this is what we're doing, I'll listen to you, but then I'm going to look at you awful close because I know a lot of folks that say a lot of things, but sometimes what they say and the reality is not all the same. We did not. Now, I know some of the fusion servers say, oh, we implemented CPG 502. All right. A lot of what I saw was echo chamber. They took other people's reports, they used their dissemination capability and sent that out. I'm not saying that wasn't a valuable service they performed. That's not the same thing as what I'm talking about. I ran a big intelligence center that did this stuff. Don't try to tell me you're doing things you're not doing. Okay. Cause I know exactly what that is. And we don't want to be FEMA the day before Katrina. So I say this as a description of what took place. And I say this with a little bit of recrimination for those who saw the money and got really greedy and kept the capability from being developed that we still need very, very much. But this thing is coming quickly. It's getting close to the end of summer. We're going to start seeing rain coming this fall. We're going to see very serious rain hitting in the winter if the 100% prediction is on track. And my question is, are we really prepared? By the way, the sort of preparedness you do on this is going to prepare you for the next pandemic. That same capability is what prepares you for major earthquakes. I can't tell you the number of things I've read talking about. We have, that the tension, the stress within the San Andreas earthquake fault zone is greater than it's been in 1,000 years. I've seen endless headlines talking about that. So we have geological issues we have to be concerned about. The fires are definitely not stopping. We're seeing these big honking fires have been happening. So that's going on. We're talking about possibly another pandemic coming. There's all sorts of issues that are out there. So developing this capability is very much needed. And we missed the boat last time. I hope we don't miss the boat this time. I hope something happens out there, but I'm saying this. And maybe I'm not saying everything's going to happen. I'm not saying we're going to fix it all, but I am saying we need to start thinking. I think a lot of people need to see the superstorm back in 1861, 62. Look it up on Wikipedia, read about it. Especially if you're in California, become aware of it. It wasn't just California. It was all the Southwest that was dramatically impacted by that weather system. But we may be looking at what hit them back then. I venture to guess may be less than what we're seeing coming at us right now. And I think we need to be wary of what's happening. And we need to get prepared. And I hope that decision makers look at this. I don't think my STRAT podcast carries all the weight in the world, but I do want to be a voice out there saying, I think we really need to start getting our act together, and we need to do it very quickly because it's coming and it looks like it's going to be really big. Hey, thanks for listening to STRAT. Also, you can visit stratpodcast.com. You can go to my YouTube channel for Hal Kempfer TV to hear all the things or see all the things that I do on a regular basis in various different networks and stuff and news stations. You can also go to the corporate website for global risk intelligence planning, www.gripsa or gripsa.com. And you can hear my assessments of what's happening out there through a variety of different forums. And I appreciate you listening, and I hope you tune in for the next one.
Strategic Risk Assessment Talk is presented by the Mutual Broadcasting System. Stay informed on the matters we discuss by visiting stratpodcast.com and other sites mentioned by Hal Kempfer. You may interact with the show through our website at stratpodcast.com or through our Facebook social media site. Thank you for joining us.